This is the price of Bitcoin on a non-log basis. I like to describe Bitcoin, and this will be my last slide before I take questions, but it is that Bitcoin is the greatest asymmetry to ever exist in the world. Most of you guys are familiar with the nature of asymmetry, but it's simply an asymmetry relative to downside versus upside. It can be the reverse, which is part of why Bitcoin is the greatest asymmetry to ever exist. I say that it's the greatest asymmetry to ever exist because no event could possibly be more positively asymmetric than the world adopting a new form of money. You could look at me and you could say that it's crazy, but that's what asymmetry is inherently about. Even if you ascribed a much lower probability to the event than I would, you still have to recognize that if the world were adopting a form of money, that event would be massively asymmetric for the holders of the currency.
Bitcoin is the greatest asymmetric bet to ever exist. That's the message out from Bitcoin expert Parker Lewis. Lewis is an on-chain Bitcoin analyst and the head of business development at Unchained Capital. Lewis has not only written whole books on Bitcoin, but he was also one of the people to convince Michael Saylor to first invest into Bitcoin. Recently, Parker Lewis did a university keynote that investors are calling the greatest explanation of Bitcoin's value of all time. Within it, he argues 2 points. First, Bitcoin is the greatest asymmetric bet to ever exist, and second, money printing is inevitable, which ultimately means Bitcoin is inevitable. Make sure to stick around to the end of the video where Parker Lewis makes a point: you don't unsee Bitcoin. Also guys, if you want to stay most up to date on the crypto and Bitcoin world, make sure to subscribe to my daily 5-minute crypto newsletter. It gives the latest expert predictions, any breaking news, and top on-chain analysis all in a nutshell. Click the first link in the description to join over 40,000 others in becoming a better crypto investor right now. Now here's Parker Lewis on why Bitcoin is the greatest asymmetric bet of all time.
Now, this is what I put forward, is that most of asymmetric events are low probability. Bitcoin adoption is probable. There's a finite surface area. You might not understand how Bitcoin enforces a fixed supply of 21 million, but if you can start to appreciate that is the signal, then you start to have a baseline to evaluate the problem. It is a known surface area, and you can actually figure out for yourself whether or not you think it to be true. Because if you think it to be true based on your own reason and logic as to how Bitcoin enforces its fixed supply, then the event is probable. The other side of it is there's negative asymmetry to hyperinflation. I don't raise the idea of hyperinflation to be fear-mongering or to scare people, but if they print $5 trillion and they're going to have to print way more money than that, there is a reality that human beings cannot continue to be compensated for their finitely scarce time in a form of money that it costs nothing to produce. Every instance of hyperinflation that's ever existed in the world comes about because of printing money. They've printed more money than we can possibly conceive of. In the last 3 years, they did it post-financial crisis. They're going to have to do it again because of that imbalance between that 96 trillion of debt that exists in the world and the only $8 trillion that exists. And so even though they've printed a ton of money, all that induces is a need for ever more. And I highlight for people here the move from 100 to 1,000 in Bitcoin, because the thing that I struggle with the most at the end is what most people struggle with the most, is that, well, haven't I already missed it? A single Bitcoin costs, well, when I did this, it was 28,000. I think it's about 28,000 now. But that was the same way that I felt when I was adopting Bitcoin, right in the middle of that when it was $500. But I've never sold a Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is just as cheap today as it ever has been because still very few people own it. And that where Bitcoin is today, 28,000, will look the same way that 100 to 1,000 move look when 10x the number of people adopt Bitcoin or 100x the number of people adopt Bitcoin. That people adopt Bitcoin if they find the true signal because it's the solution to inflation, not because it's a hedge to inflation. All of that centers around a fixed supply of 21 million. And if you can start to see on this chart where there was a rise and fall, but there have been many more in the past, and Bitcoin never goes down to those prior highs and lows for the reason that it is finitely scarce and knowledge does distribute as a function of time. More people figure it out. You don't unsee Bitcoin. And the last point that I make is that Bitcoin scarcity, while everything revolves around it, all fundamental value derives from the fact that there will only ever be 21 million. If you do not understand Bitcoin, how it works, why that is the case, why that's relevant, Bitcoin scarcity cannot be a value to you. That's why it's not a hedge. That's why a lot of people panicked and sold Bitcoin when it was 16K, and now it's sitting at 28K, and people are figuring out that Bitcoin didn't die and the Bitcoin halving is happening, but most of the world doesn't know about that. But again, I can talk to you about these ideas, but if you do not understand it, if you do not have the knowledge, it's not a value. Ultimately, it comes down to common sense. How many of you guys are familiar with Sesame Street? They have the Sesame Street segment called One of These Things things is not like the others. And what I'm demonstrating here is the percentage rate of increase in the supply of Bitcoin, it both being predictable and going down each year. That's the left side. And then I show you the rate of change of the base money of the reserve currencies of the world, the dollars, euros, yen. So, and this is from 2011 to 2022. So the percentage increase in the supply of currency. So what you can see, those big spikes the last 3 years, that was 2020. That represents that the Fed created 80% more money of base money in a single year. The euro was slightly better at increasing 50%. The yen was over 20%. But this is ultimately what Bitcoin is competing against. And each year, as Bitcoin becomes more scarce, it becomes more obvious to more people. Now, getting back to what's happening in the dollar world, because it is the problem that Bitcoin has solved. So this is the monthly year-on-year inflation rate that everyone is suffering from. The reality is, which I'll talk about, is actually far worse than this. But what the Fed and what Janet Yellen want people to focus on is that this really bad number that went from less than 2% to nearly 10% increasing year over year started to come down once the Fed started to raise interest rates. And what the Fed pays attention to really excludes the most important goods in the market, which are food and energy. And so what people in the market are feeling, and what all of you, it's like, I don't care if maybe if you're a billionaire, you're not feeling this, but most people are feeling food at the grocery store costing more, gas at the gas station costing more. And when you look at food and energy, which are better metrics to measure inflation in the market, energy, price of a gallon of gasoline is 50% more than it was in 2020. It's not going down. Price of pound of ground beef is 32% higher. These problems all derive from the money printing. Establishment economists will go through great lengths to try to explain to you every other possible way that inflation is caused, but it's all this chart. And at the same time that Bitcoin is becoming more and more scarce, they're going to have to print more and more money. This is the current state of play. So the Fed massively increased interest rates, and there are massive unrealized losses sitting on banks' balance sheets. This is the reason why they're going to have to print more money than they ever have before. So the same thing that got me to Bitcoin in the first place exists today, and the alarm bells are signaling as loud as they ever have. And the message that I tell people is, people are familiar with the fact that Silicon Valley Bank failed in March, and then First Republic functionally failed. And the same things that caused those bank failures were the rise in interest rates, and those same problems that existed then exist today. They're just bubbling underneath the surface. And one of the popular people in Bitcoin, this guy's named Max Kaiser, he always says you can't taper a Ponzi scheme. My more kind of measured way to say that is that the Fed can never raise interest rates because the debt stack is always larger and larger. And so what I'm showing is, going back prior to 2008, the Fed raised interest rates aggressively. It caused a crisis. They printed money. In 2020, or really from 2018 to 2020, they tried to raise interest rates. It caused a crisis. They come back in and print money. Now they've raised interest rates faster than they ever have before, and it's going to cause them to have to print more money than they have before, because over this time horizon, the amount of debt in the US system-wide has grown from 52.7 trillion in 2007 to 97 trillion today, or 96 trillion. This is the chart that ultimately got me into Bitcoin. This is the most important chart to understand the fiat system. That back in 2007, there was 52.7 trillion of debt in the US system. That's very vanilla. Mortgages, auto loans, student loans, credit card debt. That's not unfunded pension liabilities. It's not derivatives. It's just very vanilla, anything that you would traditionally consider a debt instrument. There was 52.7 trillion, and there was only 9 trillion in the entire existence of dollars. So the total system was leveraged over 50 times, and there was ever actually fewer dollars that existed in the banking system. So if we go to the period before 2020, when they had to print a bunch of money, the debt stack had grown by over 20 trillion. That is what necessitates that they will have to print more money. Where do we exist today from that period prior to 2020? Again, the debt stack has grown by over 20 trillion. The reason why they always have to print more money is because the introduction of new dollars actually induces the expansion of credit. It's what it's designed to do. We start from a world where there's too much debt. They have to introduce more dollars to be able to sustain existing debt levels. What does that do? It causes the debt system to grow, and then when they try to reverse out, they have to print more money, otherwise their credit system collapses. This is the money printing. It's my slide where I say, fool me once, shame on you, and it's appropriate that we got a massive mural of George Bush out there. I'll just read it so I don't screw it up, because I often screw it up just like he did. But fool me once, shame on you, fool me 4 times, shame on me. And I have 2 quotes here from Paul Tudor Jones, who's, I like to think of a very traditional investor, as to why he adopted Bitcoin. So I'll just read it so I don't screw it up. It says, and he's describing the money printing episode from March of 2020 to May of 2020. And he says, it has happened globally with such speed that even a market veteran like myself was left speechless. We are witnessing the great monetary inflation, an unprecedented expansion of every form of money, unlike anything the developed world has ever seen. That was May of 2020. And then in the same investor letter, when he was explaining to his investors why he adopted Bitcoin, he said, I also made the case for owning Bitcoin, the quintessence of scarcity premium. It is literally the only large tradable asset in the world that has a known fixed maximum supply. By its design, the total quantity of Bitcoin, including those not yet mined, cannot exceed 21 million. I don't say that people don't buy and sell Bitcoin for other reasons. I don't say that people don't speculate in Bitcoin not knowing these things. I say that the people who find the signal find it for the very reason that I put forward to you, that Bitcoin has fundamental value in the world because of its fixed supply, and it's ultimately solving the problem permanently of printing money. Where we've been at in these last 4 cycles of all this money printing, what I put forward to you is that we're in the exact same position. They are going to have to print more money than they ever have before, and when they do, more people are going to figure out Bitcoin for that reason. But for you guys in this room, you don't have to wait till the next episode of money printing. You can go ahead and take action before the flood. There's 2 key differences between the Bitcoin system and the fiat system. The fiat system, when it's exposed to stress, becomes more fragile. It becomes more fragile because of more debt and ultimately more money being printed. Bitcoin is the opposite, is the anti-fragile competitor. It doesn't matter what happens in the Bitcoin system, the thing that everybody can count on is the fixed supply. The market has to respond to failures of institutions that lent people's Bitcoin out like FTX, but that is the Bitcoin system working. It doesn't matter how many institutions fail. The one thing we can all rely on is that Bitcoin and its fixed supply cannot change. And that because of that, whereas the fiat system, when it's exposed to stress, it becomes more fragile, Bitcoin's the opposite. Bitcoin gains strength because rather than change the supply, everyone has to deal with the volatility and respond to the market conditions and absorb the volatility. Ultimately, coming back to this chart that I showed you before, that Bitcoin's fixed supply becomes more credible, that in the face of all these failures from 2022, if you guys are familiar with it, great. FTX lost 70,000 Bitcoin. A company called BlockFi lost about 50,000 Bitcoin. Celsius lost 150,000 Bitcoin. There were no bailouts. Each time there are no bailouts, Bitcoin continues to function, Bitcoin's fixed supply becomes more credible. Everything revolves and centers around this. And when the market sees that happen, more and more people figure it out.
So there's Parker Lewis on why Bitcoin is the greatest asymmetric bet in our time and why money printing is inevitable. We've traversed through complex ideas and groundbreaking perspectives, all pointing towards the same conclusion. Once you understand Bitcoin, it's impossible to unsee its potential. This isn't just about a digital currency, it's about a financial revolution that's unfolding right before our eyes. If today's discussion with Parker Lewis has sparked your interest or solidified your faith in Bitcoin's future, remember that staying informed is key. For the most up-to-date information on the crypto and Bitcoin world, don't forget to subscribe to my daily 5-minute crypto newsletter. It's your gateway to expert predictions, breaking news, and top on-chain analysis, all conveniently summarized for you. Just click the first link in the description to join a community of over 40,000 forward-thinking crypto investors. Anyway guys, hope you all enjoyed today's video and that provided you with some value.